So we'll do that after break. But today we'll get started. We'll start with sleep and sleep disorders. Sort of classically in this kind of intro psych class, this is an area where people would spend a lot of time. I want to spend more time talking about why sleep's important than you memorizing sleep spindles and the sleep stages and whatnot. You'll have to know some of it, but not in that sort of deep, arduous, boring nature. First thing you have to understand is sleep is a particular importance. And in fact, it's something that oftentimes we undervalue, particularly people who are often studying quite a bit. First thing to understand about sleep is it is actually an altered state of consciousness. It's not that you're unconscious, it's you're less aware, I guess is a better way to put it. So when we talk about altered states of consciousness, we're talking about forms of experience that depart from the sort of normal subjective experience of the world and of the mind. So you're in this altered state. But you're not really unconscious because you can be woken up, right? Who are genuinely unconscious, you can't quite rouse. Sleep is part of what we call your circadian rhythm. Your circadian rhythm is this sort of natural period of sleep and wakefulness that runs on about 24-hour clock. Closer to 25, but on roughly a 24-hour period. Our natural biological rhythms have been upset by the modern world. And that's because our circadian rhythms are primarily determined by light. Light is one of the things that's particularly important for our sleep-wake cycles. In particular, ultraviolet radiation in the or sort of light that's in the violet-blue range. So we talked about color perception. You know that you have short wavelength cones that absorb light in the blue range. Well, for some reason, that part of the spectrum is particularly important for setting your circadian rhythm clock. The reason why any of you who have Apple devices, and probably even a lot of you who have Android devices, you can set it so that if it's at night, it will not emit blue light. Anyone been doing that? It's an important thing to do. That will make it so that if you're, like me, reading something off of my Kindle app, that it's not keeping me awake by keeping your circadian rhythm thinking that it's daylight. So it sort of takes out the part of your light, part of the light that makes you think that it's daylight. All of this is governed by the hypothalamus, that tiny little part of the brain that influences the glandular system. The hypothalamus does a lot of our basic, most important processes. So our sleep-wake cycle, thirst, hunger, all of these are primarily regulated by the hypothalamus. For such a tiny little part of the brain, it's pretty important. So it's this hypothalamus that gets information from your visual system and helps sort of set that biological clock. There are some cortical connections we haven't talked about that help try to regulate this part of this cycle that go through, that end up here at the hypothalamus. We'll talk a little bit more about this. We talk about motivated behaviors, eating, sex, that sort of thing. Hypothalamus is important in those as well. One of the things that can happen for people who are sleep deprived are microsleeps. I see this happen on a daily basis from up here. Sometimes they're not very micro. I actually had to wake a student up who was snoring so loud nobody could hear what I was saying. I mean, I understand. If you nod off, believe me, I understand. There's days when I want to nod off. Most of the time, those happen because of sleep deprivation. Any significant loss of sleep will result in problems in concentration and irritability. We are coming up on one of the most dangerous days of the year. In fact, the first day we're back to campus, that Monday. Anyone know why it's the most dangerous day of the year? Anyone know what happens on Sunday? Yes, we spring forward, so we all lose an hour of sleep. Car accidents increase. Heart attacks increase. All because we have decided that we should change the clock twice a year. This happens to a lesser extent in the fall when we fall backwards, but we don't lose an hour of sleep, but we will genuinely lose an hour of sleep starting Monday morning. And so people have difficulty concentrating. No one knows when they're supposed to get up. This is really troublesome for somebody like me who has dogs, because the dogs don't know that you changed the clock. And they're like, it's time for me to pee, get up. That's more problematic in the fall time change, but excellent. So car accidents, cardiac arrests, all increase in the days following the springtime change when we lose an hour. Anyone know why we even go on daylight savings time? How this all started? It started with World War II. It was an energy-saving effort. And then after the war, there was an effort to get rid of daylight savings time, but the Backyard Barbecue Association wanted people to have more time to cook out in the summertime. So I swear to God, this is part of the history. So they lobbied Congress to keep daylight savings. Now, of course, we have this weird system where Arizona doesn't do daylight savings time, or they stay on daylight savings time. I can never remember. And then there's some weird slice of Indiana, right, that does one of the two. Colorado's thinking about switching as well. And then we probably ought to just decide, why don't we split the difference and just, change our clocks by a half hour and call it a day, right? It seems like what we ought to do is just stay on the same time. I enjoy having more time in the summer, but I really dislike it getting dark here at 4 o'clock in the winter, and that would change if we deleted that idea. So sleep deprivation can result in muscle loss, weight gain, and increased stress hormones, particularly cortisol. These are kind of all tied together. The cortisol probably is what's causing the weight gain. Stress is actually one of the things that can cause our bodies to try to store things as fat. So one of the things I always tell people who are trying to, get into shape is one of the things they need to do is make sure they're sleeping. Interestingly, there's a whole sort of causal problem with this, though, because people who exercise more sleep better. And so there's a whole question sort of where all this comes from. But we do know that people who are sleep deprived are more likely to gain weight and have higher stress levels. We're going to talk here in a minute about sleep apnea, and where it's a condition where people stop breathing in the middle of the night, and so they tend to wake up a lot. And so one of the causes and symptoms of that is weight gain and certainly increased stress hormone levels. So why do we need theory? Well, there's a couple of theories about why we need sleep and why we sleep when we do. So the first of these is the adaptive theory of sleep. Basically proposed that we kind of evolved to avoid predators and to have a time active when predators are more likely to be asleep, and most predators are nocturnal, so it's generally safer for mammals to be up and about during the daytime. Not entirely. Certainly there are predators that are active during the day, but for the most part, most predators tend to be nocturnal. The restorative theory is probably far closer to one of the reasons why sleep is so important for us. Sleep is necessary to the physical health of the body and serves to replenish chemicals and repair cellular damage. This is certainly what's happening in your brain. Your brain's busy doing a number of things, repairing cell damage, replenishing fluids, cleaning up your cerebral spinal fluid. So just kind of generally cleaning house while you're asleep. We also know that that's why while you're sleeping is when you're creating memories. That is, you're taking your experiences and permanently storing them. And that's what we think is happening with dreams is as your brain is busy consolidating your memories, you catch glimpses of it in your sort of semi-conscious state, and you try to make sense of it. But because the memories aren't related in any way, they end up with a bunch of very strange things happening. The other night I was getting bit by a rattlesnake. I don't know why that was happening, but I don't know where the snake came from. It was rather upsetting. I was more upset by that than the nuclear war that happened in my earlier dream. Um, I was in a bunker with Donald Trump, and I swear to God, this was the dream I was having. Like nuclear war raining all around us, and we're just sitting there having a chat. I was like, that was sort of less upsetting than the snake. We'll talk about what happens when you actually are a little sleep deprived. You do what's called REM rebound, and you dream a lot. So one of the things that's happening while you're sleeping is you're creating long-term memories. Your brain is busy consolidating your experiences into permanently stored memories. So as you're sleeping, those experiences are becoming permanently stored. We talk about how memories are formed. We'll talk a little bit about there's sort of a temporal nature to a head injury, for example. So if you have a head injury, one of the things that can happen is you'll lose some of the time around that head injury. And that's because some of those memories haven't been permanently stored yet. And oftentimes people never recover that time period. There's an article posted to Slate, I think yesterday. Interestingly, one of the things that ER doctors do to try to make sure that you're oriented. Does anyone know the questions they ask in the ER? Your name, where you are, and who the president is. And this ER doctor keeps having to break the news to people that don't remember that Donald Trump's president, that he's president. You have to find it. It's on Slate. It's a really funny article. Like one person said, I voted for him, but I didn't think he'd win. So it's really pretty. It's pretty interesting. That's a pretty interesting sort of cultural phenomenon, and that's one of those just weird questions people ask. And people that have dementia, they'll answer like Jimmy Carter, or most people sort of think President Obama or President Bush are still president because they've kind of lost some chunk of time. But I suggest reading it. If I think to, I'll post it to Canvas. Oh, I forgot I had this on here. So let me go to Top Hack really quick. This is what happens when I don't pay attention. Anybody need this attendance code before I do anything to make it go away? All right. So I'm going to have you fill this out. Okay, so that's up. You'll go through and you'll give yourself 0 to 3 points, how likely you are to doze off or fall asleep in the following situations. 0 would never doze, 1 slight chance, 2 moderate chance, 3 high chance. So the first one is sitting and talking to someone, so just write that number down or add it, put it in a calculator. Sitting inactive in a public place, how likely are you to fall asleep? Sitting quietly after lunch without alcohol, sitting and reading, watching television, lying down to rest in the afternoon, in a car while stopped in traffic, or as a passenger in a car. And then go ahead and enter that into Top Hack. So everybody done with that? Okay, so let's see where everyone's at. Get a chance to finish filling those in. Actually, I can do this. So those of you who are in the 10 or above range might want to think about seeing a sleep specialist. That's what the scale recommends. Because you probably shouldn't be falling asleep. Cars are kind of one of those weird things. Parents have gotten into this habit of putting infants into the car to get them to go to sleep, so a lot of people do that. My ex-boyfriend, I've never seen someone sleep in a car that quickly. We were not even out of a parking lot one day, and he fell asleep. So this is what, I'm kind of, funny. I think I'm funny, but I didn't know that he thought that. So I would do things like I'd turn his heated seat on, and so he'd wake up like, it's hot. Or I'd be pulling up to a stoplight, and I'd slam on the brakes. We'd be going like 2 miles an hour, but I'd stop all of a sudden and wake up. I thought it was funny. I don't know that he did. You got to find something to entertain yourself. It might as well be that. There's one day we were driving back from Atlanta, and we were crossing a lake, and he woke up as we were crossing it and thought we were going into the lake and screamed. And I was like, what? Scared the shit out of me. So if you're one of those people, and then one day actually I had to wake him up while he was driving, so that was, so there are several different stages of sleep for us to talk about, and we'll talk more about sleep disorder here in a moment. REM sleep is rapid eye movement sleep. This is when you're dreaming. This is a stage of sleep in which the eyes move rapidly under the eyelids. This is typically when you're experiencing some kind of dream. You can actually see this. Some of you may have actually seen either your pets or people sleeping near you, their eyes moving. It's kind of freaky underneath their eyelids. Non-REM sleep is the rest of the sleep stages. REM sleep seems to be the most important from a psychological perspective, so we tend to focus a lot on that. The non-REM stages are important probably for your health and overall well-being. But REM sleep seems to be when your brain is the most active and really the most similar to sort of your conscious waking time. So we'll take a look at what these stages look like, talk a little bit about how you tend to typically go through the night. All of this data is usually gathered with EEG equipment. So electroencephalography, you put scalp electrodes on a person, and then they try to sleep with that on, and then you can measure their brainwave activity as they go along. So this is typically how this goes. So this is what the data looks like for each of these electrodes. You can see probably one of these is heart rate, electromyography, etc. These are probably near the eyelids because you get a lot of large wave sleep. So, and these actually are probably different stages. Sorry, I have to look at what this says in here. So here we have awake. Now, generally, just kind of spiky along. Then as you start to fall asleep, you go through stage 1. About 10 minutes here. Real easy to wake up in stage 1. Oftentimes people, as they start to fall asleep, will wake back up as they find themselves falling asleep. Anyone done that in public? That's a high self-esteem movement. Particularly if you're like me, go like jerk awake. That's always nice. Then in stage 2, you get these kind of sleep spindles, so bursts of activity. About 20 minutes in this stage. Then stage 3, you start to get these slower, longer wavelength patterns in your brain. And then when you get into stage 4, this is when you get this very deep troughs of brain activity. This is when you're in your deepest sleep, very hard to wake up. Like a house could probably fall on me at this point. I don't know that I would stir because I sleep very deeply. And that lasts for about 30 to 40 minutes. And then you move sort of back up closer to awake, and this is when you're in REM sleep. And this can last for a few minutes to a few hours or an hour. And then you cycle back through and back up. As you go through the night, you get into stage 4 sleep less. So you don't get that deep of sleep later in the night. But for the first couple hours, you cycle down into stage 4 and then up into REM, and then cycle back into stage 4 and then back up into REM. And you kind of then cycle down into stage 3 and stage 2 as the night goes on. So this is what these kind of waves look like. You get sort of awake alertness. Stage 1 is associated with these theta waves. Really, stage 4 delta waves. This is really the more important sort of kind of brainwave activity we're talking about, because it's very deep, very sort of slow activity brainwaves, indicative of a completely different phenomenon from being awake and alert. And you can see stage 1 REM and awake and alert are not all that different in terms of their brainwave activity. Probably a lot of the REM stage is different simply because you're not actually moving around, and so you tend to get a little bit lower spikes, but much more similar to being awake. Throughout the night, as I was saying, for the first couple cycles, you'll go down into stage 4, then up into REM, then back down into stage 4. And as you get further into the night, you don't dip as deep. And then as you get closer to being awake, you tend to be much more in the shallow oriented, which is why if you wake up in this time period, you can usually get right up, right? Whereas if you are woken up somewhere in here, it's much harder to pull yourself back around, right? So REM sleep is actually what we call paradoxical sleep, because there's a high level of brain activity. If you're awakened during REM sleep, you'll almost always report what you were dreaming. This is one of the reasons why people who sleep sort of through the night oftentimes don't remember their dreams, because they don't wake up during them. It's people that wake up, even if they don't remember waking up, that tend to remember their dreams. As you get older, you'll find it's harder to sleep as solidly. At least I've discovered that. One phenomenon probably some of you have discovered, if you haven't noticed, is called REM rebound. And REM rebound occurs when you have not had REM sleep. If you've been deprived of REM sleep on earlier nights, you'll get an increased amount of REM sleep in the following night, sort of a catch-up. So if you've either been sleep deprived or taken a sleep aid or had alcohol, oftentimes these will inhibit REM sleep. And so sometimes you can get this kind of REM rebound, which is I think what happened the other night when I was in crazy dreamland. I had the night before taken a sleep aid, slept really great, felt great when I woke up the next morning, and then the following night it was like crazy dream central. Anyone fallen asleep and gone straight into a dream and had that happen? It kind of freaks you out, because you lay down on the couch for like I'm going to sleep for 5 minutes, and the next thing you know, like you're in cuckoo land, right? Like, that's a sign that you're sleep deprived, or certainly you have not had enough REM sleep. Some nightmares are, of course, bad dreams that occur during REM sleep. Now, one person's nightmare could be some other person's regular dream, just depends on context. There's a whole new weird pharmacology in this, that one known side effect to certain medications are much more intense dreams. In fact, I was on one of these drugs for quite a while, and it was really, the dreams were quite vivid and intense, and it's not very clear why these drugs cause that effect. But you do get a lot more lucid dreaming. Anyone familiar with that term? Yeah, where you know you're in a dream. I mean, that's more fun, because then you can take control of it, or do things like wake yourself up, right? I've done that before. I'm like, no, I'm not going to do that. So, force myself awake. Okay, I don't know why this is all in some sort of weird order. So, historical views of dreams. This is worth noting, because this is one of those areas that people always want to talk about. What do your dreams mean? Yeah, they mean that you got a good night's sleep. They don't really mean anything else. But historical view is this idea that there is manifest content, that is a dream's apparent topic or superficial meaning. So I'm afraid of snakes, which is true, but then there's the latent content, which is a dream's, not a dram's, true underlying meaning. This is where we slip into the Freudian Jungian analysis of our dream states, and how what we really want is underlying that latent content of dreams. The idea behind this is that dreams may represent wishes, suppressed thoughts, activity we're interested in, things that we aren't consciously aware of, our suppressed desires. I'm quite sure I have no suppressed desire to be in a bunker with the president during nuclear war. Also quite sure I don't really want to get bit by a rattlesnake. Same thing kept biting me too. Of course, if I'd have put it down, it probably would have stopped. Much more likely is what we call the activation synthesis model, which is the theory that dreams are produced when the brain attempts to make sense of activations that are occurring during sleep. So most likely this is as your memories are trying to get consolidated. You'll end up getting glimpses of what's happening during your dreams and trying to make sense of that. Your sort of unconscious mind is trying to interpret all this weird stuff that's happening at the same time, and that's how you end up with these kind of dreams. Anyone ever fallen asleep with the TV on and had whatever you were watching become part of your dream? That's a weird experience, right? One night I fell asleep with the TV, and when I was friends with the guy on the local news when I lived in South Carolina, and all of a sudden he was in my dream, and I woke up and I was like, oh, it's on the news. No wonder. Sort of this bizarro land. So, one of the last things to talk about in this topic is sleep disorders. Insomnia is the most common. Difficulty in falling asleep or staying asleep. It's also notoriously difficult to treat. This is probably one of the most common sort of disorders that people suffer from. And there is as much bad advice as there is good advice out there. In fact, probably a lot more bad advice about how best to sleep. What you need to do is kind of figure out what works best for you. You know, people are always like, your bedroom has to be only for sleeping. Well, that's for people who have 10-bedroom houses and can figure out what else they can do in other rooms. I have to have a desk and a TV and everything in one room because, you know, I live in Washington, D.C., you know. Some of you only live in your bed, like only have one room, so. So in terms of treating insomnia, you know, there's sometimes exercise really helps people. In fact, it's probably one of the most benign ways to help someone get a better night's sleep. Obviously, cutting out caffeine late in the day. That particularly becomes an issue as you get older. We metabolize caffeine more slowly, particularly much older adults. And so they end up, caffeine affects them for much longer than it does in younger adults. You know, when I was your age, I could drink coffee until right before I went to bed and go to sleep. Now, like, it's cutoff time already, so I want to go to sleep at an early time. Sleep apnea occurs when a person stops breathing for brief periods while asleep. One of the major symptoms of this is people who snore a lot or very loudly. If you don't know whether or not you snore, you can download an app that will record your sleeping. I did this the other night just for kicks and giggles. I already know that I snore very loudly because I wake myself up some days. But I don't think I ever stopped breathing in any of it. And frankly, the treatment for sleep apnea is that CPAP device. Anybody have to wear one of those? I'm really claustrophobic, so unless somebody's going to come put me down to sleep every night with propofol, I'm not wearing one. I'll just die in my sleep one day. Perfectly happy with that. Perfectly happy with that idea. Somnambulism is a nice big fancy word for sleepwalking. Somnolescence is sort of the technical word for sleeping. So somnambulism is simply sleepwalking. Not very many adults do this. Certainly not many adults who have not been imbibing in, you know, various and sundry alcoholic drinks. Some people will actually think they're sleepwalking when they take sleep aids like Ambien. What's actually happening is they're awake. They just don't remember being awake, and so they think they've sleptwalked. One of the major side effects of those drugs is people will wake up in the morning and can't find their car because they've gone somewhere in it and parked it somewhere else. Or they'll discover there's a bunch of food missing from their refrigerator and think somebody's come in and robbed them because they don't remember eating any of it. Narcolepsy is a sudden sleep attack that occurs in the middle of waking activities. We're going to talk about a narcolepsy drug here in a few minutes, if we get to it. This is particularly devastating for people who have real severe forms of narcolepsy because they will just fall asleep while standing up. All sorts of crazy things. There's a really terrific movie with Keanu Reeves and River Phoenix called My Own Private Idaho, where River Phoenix plays a guy with narcolepsy. I highly recommend it. It's a really terrific movie. Sleep paralysis, one of the things that happens while you're asleep, you're actually paralyzed because your brain just shuts off signals to your spinal cord essentially shuts off any movement to your muscles. And so what happens in sleep paralysis is people wake up before the paralysis has stopped. And so you can imagine that's rather panic-inducing because they wake up and can't move. And it takes a few minutes for them to wake up before they can move. You know that this hasn't happened to me because I haven't had a heart attack. Because this would cause me more panic than I think I could even describe. And the night terrors are people who have abrupt awakenings with panic and intense emotional arousal and generally wake up screaming. My brother actually has very bad night terrors, even as an adult. This is something that's more common in kids, but is problematic for some adults. Sometimes this can be associated with PTSD. Certainly problematic for both the person and their romantic partners. There is some evidence for benefits to couples sleeping in separate beds because people tend to get better night's sleep. So there's sort of this weird movement towards people sleeping in separate rooms or separate beds to get a better night's sleep. So if some of you may know couples that do that. Well, I do have to show you, because it's simply required of interest psychology, I have to show you Rusty the narcoleptic dog, but I'm going to have to look him up because he never seems to want to play. This is one of my favorite film clips ever. We have to watch it again, right? Oh, wait. That's Rusty, the narcoleptic dog. So, I think this microphone's actually coming through the speakers, which is rather odd. So, that's Rusty the narcoleptic dog. The other thing you should look up on YouTube is fainting goats. Anyone ever looked at those? Very entertaining. But to kind of sum up, I feel like I'm echoing here. Sleep, very important for us from an emotional and cognitive perspective, certainly important from a health perspective. One of the things you want to make sure is you're getting a healthy amount of sleep. So if you are someone who scored very high on that Epworth Sleepiness Scale, it's worth talking to your doctor about. In fact, a lot of physicians and dentist's office have started giving that Epworth Sleepiness Scale. In fact, the first time I encountered it was at my dentist's office, because they oftentimes encounter people who have sleep disorders, and it can affect your teeth if you sleep with your mouth open. If you're a mouth breather like I am, mostly because I can never breathe through my nose, they'll oftentimes refer people to an allergist or whatnot. Okay, any questions about sleep before we get into drugs? All right. One of the things we can talk about is how drugs are, in fact, an altered form of consciousness, or can be thought of that way. So when we talk about psychoactive drugs, we're talking about chemicals that influences consciousness or behavior by altering the brain's chemical message system. So pretty much all drugs influence neurotransmitters. And one of the reasons why we went over neurotransmitter systems is it becomes particularly important under this topic. So drugs like cocaine affect dopamine and norepinephrine. In particular, drugs like amphetamines affect norepinephrine. Other drugs like club drugs like ecstasy primarily affect serotonin. So we'll talk a little bit about those. One of the things that's important to understand about how drugs are handled by the body is we can develop what's called drug tolerance. Drug tolerance happens for a variety of reasons. One of them is your body gets better at metabolizing them. In fact, one of the things we're going to talk about when we get to classical conditioning is your body actually will prepare, if you're abusing drugs, will prepare for the sort of onslaught of whatever drug you're taking. So for example, heroin users, when they start putting their stuff together to shoot up, their body will start reducing more enzymes to break down that heroin. Because these things are all processed by the liver, and so your body learns, based on visual cues, when to expect certain things to happen. And so you'll actually develop what we call metabolic tolerance. The other thing that happens is the regulation of your brain, of your neural cells, changes over time because of the presence of the drug. So they respond less to the presence of the drug, and as a result, you need more to get the same response. As a result of that, you can get drug withdrawal. In fact, withdrawal is almost always the opposite of whatever the effect is for a drug. So a drug like cocaine causes people to be up, awake, alert, very happy, generally, well, sometimes a little paranoid. As a result, people that are withdrawing from cocaine tend to be moody, down, depressed, want to sleep a lot. One of the biggest things with people who are withdrawing from amphetamines is they want to sleep all the time. And I always tell people, let them sleep, because they've got to recover from that. Drug addiction itself has lots of different definitions. The DSM-5, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which we may get to later in the semester, now describes these as substance use disorders. Because addiction has a meaning that somebody is physically addicted, that they can't actually function without the drug. And there are some drugs that have that, for sure. Some drugs are more addictive than others. Certainly nicotine, heroin are the most addictive. But, and alcohol particularly. It's more important to understand not whether or not somebody is physically addicted to a drug, but is their use of it causing harm in their life or disruption in their life. And so that's where we get into substance use disorders. So you can actually go to the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration and take a look at how all these disorders are classified. But essentially, there are a number of criteria you have to meet. Number of times you're using the drug. Are you missing work because of it? Are you not happy because of it? Do you not have relationships because of it? Has it disrupted your marriage? That has to be disrupting your life. So just because somebody uses a drug doesn't mean they have a substance use disorder. Any questions about that? Basic introduction. Well, I want to start with some pharmacology basics. The reason why I cover this is certainly not something that's covered anywhere in your textbook, I don't think, is what I can tell you now about antidepressants or antipsychotics or even street drugs won't matter next year or the year after, because there'll be something new, right? There'll be something new that people are taking. But this stuff is an important part of any drug you might take, either whether it's prescribed or otherwise. So this is an important component of understanding how drugs work and how to be a smart consumer of these kind of products. So we'll start with pharmacokinetics. Pharmacokinetics refers to how drugs are handled by the body. Pharmacodynamics is how drugs affect your behavior. And then we'll talk about effective dose and lethal dose. So pharmacokinetics refers to how the drug is handled by the body. So from introduction to what we call peak plasma concentration to elimination. So once a drug gets into your blood system, eventually it will reach what we call peak plasma concentration. And this is the point at which, after you've taken it, its amount has peaked in your blood. So for example, if you take A dose of Adderall, it'll reach peak plasma concentration in an hour and a half to 2 hours. It takes about 2 hours to reach peak plasma concentration. It takes much longer to eliminate. It takes about 3.5 days to eliminate a single dose of Adderall. So elimination is how the drug is actually completely finally processed out. Almost all drugs you might take are processed out through your urine. Marijuana goes the other route. So the efficiency of a drug's introduction depends on its route of administration. So you can take a drug in a variety of different ways. There are what we call the enteral routes and the para-enteral routes, but basically they are either they go through your digestive system or they don't. Things that go through your digestive system are much more effective if they're lipid soluble, that is, they dissolve in fat, and also if they don't get broken down by your stomach acid. So, for example, there is currently no version of testosterone or those kind of anabolic steroids that will survive your digestive system. So those drugs all have to be administered some other way. The other GI route of administration is suppositories or enemas. Apparently there's quite a fad of doing alcohol enemas. I don't recommend this. Very dangerous thing to do. Also, then, if you end up with alcohol poisoning, you got to explain to somebody how you got it. That's going to be embarrassing. So the fastest routes of drug administration are intravenous, in terms of their effect on the brain, intranasal and sublingual, and actually, I should say, inhaled. Oftentimes, inhaled drugs hit the brain the fastest because they go straight into the heart, and so through the lungs, straight to the heart, up into the brain. But these tend to be the quickest. Both intranasal and sublingual is under your tongue. The only drugs that can be administered intranasally and sublingually are those that are water soluble. So one thing people will do is they'll crush up drugs like Xanax and snort them. Xanax is fat soluble, it's not water soluble. And so that actually is not an effective means of administration. I was actually reading an article about a police officer who supposedly crashed his car after snorting Xanax, and I was like, there's something more to the story. He must have taken some of them, or chewed some of them, or done something, because it actually won't get absorbed by your nasal mucosa. Slower routes are, again, the enteral routes, which are pills and suppositories, because they have to go through your digestive system, and intramuscular. More often people use intramuscular injection for fat-soluble drugs, and usually they are actually dissolved in, like glycerin, something like that, because then they get released more slowly. Oftentimes the reason to do an intramuscular dose is to do a slower release of that drug. More modern drug delivery systems are long-term intramuscular delivery systems. So contraceptives for both women, and a new drug that they're developing for men are implanted usually in the tricep muscle, and then they dissolve slowly over time, and as a result they only need to go in every 3 months or every year for treatment to have those drugs replaced. So those are some pretty good things to keep an eye on. These kind of newer drug delivery systems that either go under the skin or in the muscle to sort of slowly release drugs over time. Critical importance for understanding drug dosing is what's called the elimination half-life. It's also sometimes called the clearance time. This is the amount of time required for the body to eliminate half of a dose. That's called half-time. Pretty much every drug on the planet except for alcohol has an elimination half-life. You can eliminate about 1 drink an hour. No matter how many you've had, you're going to eliminate about 1 an hour. So it's something to keep in mind. Alcohol's got some other issues we'll talk about here in a bit. Men have much higher levels of alcohol dehydrogenase in our digestive systems, and as a result, we tend to break down much more alcohol before it's even absorbed than women do. It's one of the reasons why Women can only drink about half as much as men do. Has a lot to do with the levels of that enzyme in the digestive system. Also, body size plays a big part of that as well. So all drugs follow this elimination half-life pattern. So for example, let's see if it's on this next slide. No, that would be too easy. We'll do something simple. So a drug like Adderall, which is D-amphetamine, has an elimination half-life of approximately 12 hours. 10 to 12 hours. Everything is a little bit different depending on the person. So if you take 10 milligrams at 10 p.m., I don't know what you're up to taking speed at 10 o'clock at night, but let's just not judge for right now. At 10 a.m., you'll have 5 milligrams left. 10 p.m. the next day, you'll have 2.5 milligrams. At 10 a.m. the following day, 1.25, etc. So every 12 hours, you're eliminating half of whatever you have. So one of the important things about half-life is it doesn't matter how much you've taken, you're going to eliminate all of it in about the same time, right? So even if this was 100 milligrams, then we're down to 50, 25, 12.5, etc. Alcohol is very different. You get 1 per hour. So if you have 10 drinks in an hour, which I don't recommend, you got 10 hours of unpleasantness before that starts to get eliminated, because you can only eliminate a drink an hour. So from a treatment perspective, so we're not talking about a drug of abuse, and we're talking about trying to treat someone's with whatever it is we're trying to treat. One of the goals is to reach what we call steady state. And essentially, you want to try to reach the point where they're eliminating and taking in as much as at the same time. So you end up with this sort of steady state of drug level. This is determined by dosing schedule and elimination half-life, or what we call clearance time. As a rule, it takes about 5.5 to 6 half-lives to reach steady state, because that's the point at which you're taking in as much as you're putting back out. So the longer the half-life is, the longer it's going to take you to actually get to the point where you have enough in your bloodstream to get an effective dose. Sometimes, put on here. Oh, there it is. Sometimes a loading dose is used to reach that peak plasma or that steady state plasma concentration earlier. That is, so I'm sure almost everyone here has at some point taken a Z-Pack, right? What do you do on the first day? Take 2, right? You take double the dose on the first day. The reason for that is they give you this loading dose so that instead of having to go through a couple of half-lives to get to steady state, they get you there in one day, and then you stay there. So that loading dose gets you up to the appropriate level, and then the maintenance dose is what keeps you at the appropriate level. All this becomes important because some of you will go on to prescribe drugs, take them, have to deal with children who are taking them, and sometimes it's important to understand how long it takes to eliminate a drug, etc., to think about whether or not to take it again. Also, it's important to understand how this all works from just a user perspective. We call this understanding the model of how it works. It allows you to be a smarter user. So for example, one of the drugs I take has like a 4.5-day half-life. So if I miss it one day, it's really not a big deal, right? I'm not even halfway through a half of a half-life. So that helps you to sort of regulate, things like anxiety and whatnot. So drugs are metabolized by liver enzymes and secreted by the kidneys. Primarily the cytochrome P450 class of enzymes. Cytochrome P3A, 2D6, and I can't remember the other one, are the primary ones. Those drug metabolites that are the sort of leftover products of this process, form the basis for urine testing for drugs. So if they're going to ask you for a urine sample, they're actually testing not for the drug itself, but for its leftover metabolite. Now, some drugs have very active metabolites. So, for example, methamphetamine is secreted in urine as amphetamine. I'm not going to tell you what people who have used methamphetamine will often do to recapture that leftover amphetamine. I'll leave that to your imagination. Just say it usually involves drinking something. You know, when you're drinking your own pee, you've probably gone down the tube a little ways. I'm just going to say, I don't judge about what people do, but unless you're just doing it for pure recreation, that's fine. So pharmacodynamics, I know you guys are like, all right, now this has gotten gross. Hey, sometimes you have to tell this like it is. So pharmacodynamics relates to the effects of drugs at their target. For psychoactive drugs, we tend to focus on neurotransmitter levels and neurotransmitter systems. Important thing to know about pharmacodynamics is when you introduce a drug to your body, it goes everywhere, right? And so most side effects are occurring somewhere else. That is, there's where you want the dose to go, and then it goes everywhere else, and that's where it tends to screw up your life. So, for example, back to azithromycin, which is what's in the Z-Pack, it's been recently linked to cardiac arrest. And so that's obviously a side effect at the cardiac muscle. For most psychoactive drugs, we're interested in getting things to the brain. One of the biggest problems with this is getting things past the blood-brain barrier. Because the blood-brain barrier actually blocks a lot of drugs from reaching the brain. So the last bit on pharmacology basics are effective dose and lethal dose. The effective dose is the dose at which it is effective for 50% of the population. We call this the ED50. So we give people this dose, 50% will respond, 50% won't. We'll probably have to increase the dose if they don't respond. Lethal dose is the lethal dose for 50% of the population. So the LD50 is the dose at which it is lethal for 50% of the population. This is all done, I should say, in animal testing. We don't line up 100 people and go, well, we're going to see how much it takes to kill half of you. We do that with rats, or primarily rats. Obviously, then it's scaled up to people, depending on the type of drug. Now, obviously, this is an important sort of ratio. That is, if the effective dose is near the lethal dose, it's probably not a very good drug, right? In fact, most of the time, a drug is approved. They actually look at the ED99 and the LD1. That is, they want the effective dose for 99% of the population and the lethal dose for 1% of the population. And this really can vary. So the effective dose for LSD, simply for somebody who's using LSD recreationally, is very low. It's in the micrograms. The lethal dose is enormous. Like, the amount of LSD required to overdose is in the grams. And so the odds of somebody ever, and I think the hundreds of grams, so the odds of anyone ever overdosing on LSD is almost impossible because the effective dose and lethal dose are so far apart. Whereas drugs like heroin are pretty close to one another. Well, in the time being, time remaining, let's talk a little bit about different kinds of drugs, different types of psychoactive drugs. We talk about depressants, stimulants, narcotics, hallucinogens. Marijuana kind of is a light hallucinogen. Primarily, though, these are the categories we often talk about for psychoactive drugs, particularly drugs of abuse. And depressants are drugs that depress your central nervous system, drugs like alcohol, Benzodiazepine sedatives like Xanax, Ativan, Valium, Ambien. Those are all depressants. Stimulants are the caffeines, nicotines, amphetamines, cocaines of the world. Narcotics are primarily pain relievers: heroin, morphine, fentanyl, oxycodone, OxyContin, hydrocodone. Hallucinogens are drugs like LSD, PCP, MDMA, MDA, ketamine, and then, of course, marijuana. So, this table's in your drug, or in your drug. This table's in your drug. This table's in your book. I want to make something very clear. I don't particularly believe that this is true for everyone. Your book has taken this old school line of we have to scare everyone to be afraid of drugs. You guys know that physical and psychological dependence and overdose risks for these things are not as high as they say there is. Is there a risk? Of course, everything's got risk. But I think it's more important for you to have a reasonable, informed, genuinely informed opinion about these things. So, for example, here they put overdose possibility for hallucinogens all in one category. Well, it's almost impossible to overdose on LSD and quite easy to overdose on ketamine, so I don't really think they've done a very good job with this. So this will never be on an exam, this table here, because I think it's a bunch of crap. Was that specific enough for you? It's much more important that you have a better, true understanding of how these things work, understand the real risk. There are risks. I'm not saying these are not recommendations I'm making, but I do want you to have a better understanding of these things. By the way, I'm teaching a drugs and human behavior class online this summer, so if you're really interested in this topic, you can take my online class this summer. You have a little bit of a head start. So depressants are substances that reduce CNS activity. Alcohol is the primary one of these. So we call it the sort of king of depressants. One, it's obviously the most pervasive. It's the one people use the most. So that's why we sort of refer to it as the king of depressants. Alcohol has also a very paradoxical nature in that it does have, at low doses, a slight stimulant effect. That is, people get a little rowdy when they're drinking, right? And so it's got this weird dose response, so it's got a little stimulant-like effect, and then you go beyond that into depressant effects. How alcohol affects people really depends on their expectations. We call this expectancy theory. The idea that alcohol effects can be pronounced by people's expectation of how it will influence them in particular situations. This is a really difficult thing to study because you have to come up with some really brilliant placebo conditions, because alcohol has some of the highest placebo effects. So you have to be very careful about how you do this kind of balanced placebo design. In fact, they have to do these sort of sham bartender situations where a fake drink is made in front of them to make them think they've been given an alcoholic drink, because there are just really strong effects, placebo effects from this. This is a weird term to talk about. We call it alcoholic myopia. It's a condition that results when alcohol hampers attention. So this isn't about, beer goggles, as people call them. This is more about people respond in very sort of simple, sometimes almost animalistic ways to complex situations. So people that are quite drunk are not well-reasoned, and as a result they have narrow focus of attention. That's the reason why people who are drunk are much more likely to be victims of crime, because they're not paying attention, and much more likely to get into dangerous situations. And so one of those things you have to be very careful with, in particular when you're out with your friends over spring break, for example. Keep an eye on each other and make sure they're not getting into trouble. Always good to have some kind of buddy system, make sure you're taking care of each other. Other kinds of depressants include barbiturates. Nobody uses those much anymore. They're just really dangerous, so nobody prescribes them much. Benzodiazepines, probably the most common psychotropic medication prescribed, particularly in this class. I don't know why toxic inhalants is listed as something that's prescribed to treat anxiety or sleep problems. It's not, but they are central nervous system depressants. Benzodiazepines are most commonly prescribed to treat anxiety or sleep disorders. These are drugs like Valium, Xanax, Ativan, Ambien, Transine, a whole class of them. Biggest effects of benzodiazepines are they have pretty significant effects on memory. So anyone who's under the influence of a benzodiazepine will have reduced memory performance. And this is greatly exacerbated by the presence of alcohol. They affect the same neurotransmitter systems. So benzodiazepines are not something to mix with liquor. Stimulants are substances that excite the central nervous system, heightening arousal and activity levels. Caffeine is the most commonly used psychotropic drug in the world. It's used in almost every culture. Coffee, tea. So this includes caffeine, amphetamines, nicotine, cocaine. Ecstasy is weird. It's a hallucinogen and a stimulant all in one. Its chemical structure is methylene dioxymethamphetamine, so it's most closely related to methamphetamine. But that methyl dioxy group really dramatically changes its chemical components. Modafinil is a drug prescribed to treat narcolepsy. It has started to gain a whole different use as a cognitive enhancer. People actually take it to be more alert, and it's actually been shown to improve fluid intelligence. So when we get to talking about intelligence, we'll actually talk about modafinil and some of the issues involved with people having access to it. It probably shouldn't. They've been calling it nerd steroids. That's really what they've been calling it. So stimulants elicit euphoria, also confidence and motivation. So you get increases in dopamine and norepinephrine in the brain, really depending on which of these drugs you're talking about. MDMA actually affects serotonin more than anything else. Oftentimes these drugs are co-abused with other drugs. Obviously nicotine and alcohol. Cocaine and alcohol are also oftentimes used together. And the reason for that is in the presence of alcohol, alcohol actually alters its metabolic properties. And in fact, alcohol will actually increase the stimulant potency of cocaine because it metabolizes into cocaethylene. And cocaethylene is actually a more potent, a little bit longer lasting version of cocaine. So most people that are abusing cocaine also drink alcohol at the same time. Narcotics are opiates. Most of these are derived from opium to relieve pain. So these things include heroin, morphine, oxycodone, methadone, codeine, OxyContin, fentanyl. All of these are designed to relieve pain. Unfortunately, they also are potentially highly addictive. In fact, they are some of the most addictive drugs prescribed. Huge problem in the United States right now with opioid and opiate overdose. One of the problems is these drugs primarily influence the brainstem, particularly they have their pain exerting influences at the para-aqueductal gray, but they also influence the medulla oblongata, which is primarily responsible for heart rate and respiration. And so most people that overdose on these drugs, it's because they stop breathing. Fortunately, there's actually a drug that immediately reverses the effects of these drugs. It's called Narcan or naloxone. So there's lots of efforts to try to make that more widely available. The problem is anyone who's given the drug probably needs to get into treatment because it will instantly induce withdrawal because it essentially blocks all the effects of any drugs they've taken. These drugs are very closely related to endorphins. In fact, they are what we call an exogenous endorphin. They influence the same neurotransmitter systems or the same receptor sites, and in fact mimic the effects of endorphins. Cannabis has a similar effect on the same neurotransmitter systems, which is why it can oftentimes result in pain relief. All right, I'm going to leave it here because I want to get your exams back. So we'll finish up these last couple of drugs